That is absolutely correct. So we are looking at where we work, how we work, what are things going to be like post-COVID when we can all come back to work together. We're certainly not an organization that is saying, hey, look, we've been so successful working remotely that we're going to let everybody work remotely from now on. I think that's not, necessarily where we're going. But what I can also say is that we are not going to force people to go into the office. That's for sure.
Right.
Again, in line with our people first approach, we want to make sure that anybody who's going into the office is doing it because they really want to be there. But we do have, we are working on figuring out how do we bring teams of people back in safely into the office. But also along those lines, we are looking at how do we turn this into an opportunity to really improve the work environment for everybody and think about, well, how can it add more value to the company and to the work we do?
What do you think are the biggest challenges for talent management in the immediate future?
I think that, going back to the discussion that we had at the beginning where we were talking about, well, what is this talent function anyway? It's so broad now, right? Talent is no longer that subset of people in an organization who've been kind of identified as the elite few or the hypos, right? This is about our people and this is about enabling all of our people. And so I guess the breadth of it and figuring out how do you tackle that, I think for me is one of the toughest problems that I'm facing is there's so many, it's such a big area, right? How do you make choices about what you're going to focus on and who you're going to focus on when it's really more about all of your people?
It makes me think a little bit about some work that Danny did before on the learning side, where the sort of shift was, learning used to be the responsibility of one small group, like the learning team. The change that needed to happen is that everybody needed to take accountability and responsibility for it. And the learning organization was not just a department, but it was the entire organization. It sounds like a similar shift going on.
I couldn't agree more. It's great that you bring that up because that's one of the models that I've been promoting now for several years and that we're really focusing on. I think I mentioned earlier that we've expanded our coaching opportunities as part of wanting to help managers to learn how to be more flexible in how they manage. And our coaches are not just people from the people function. We have built out a coaching capability that is broader than that. And we've invited people who are, in the business who are interested in learning how to be coaches and have helped to build their skill set so that we can offer that. And because there's no way we could ever possibly meet the needs of an organization this size with the number of people who we have. So we need to be super smart about how do we scale these things up, right? We need to be super smart about how we scale up and how we operate at scale. And this is another area that I've been very focused on, which I guess, now that I think about it is a challenge. I didn't think about it that way before. Making sure that we have developmental opportunities for so many more people than what we've been able to do in the past, right? And,
yes.
Typically you remember the times where we had a program and we launched it maybe for 15 people and they said, well, okay, we'll pilot it this year and next year maybe we'll double it. You can't do that anymore. You've got to scale it up quickly because especially if you're going to change culture and looking at how things change so quickly and how much you need to spend time with people, it's so crucial that we're working on these things at scale. So I think that's one thing. I would also add that another area that I haven't talked about, I'm really excited about how we've tackled it is this whole performance experience. And I've mentioned a couple of times that we're reimagining performance management and we call it Thrive, the new performance experience. And we're working with intact teams. So we're not doing broad training across the board to try to convince people to do something different. What we're doing is we're using Agile. Like that's what we're doing. We're experimenting. We invited teams to come and join us, intact teams. We have advisors who are aligned to those teams and who are responsible for them. And we work with those teams as we're implementing the different phases or the different elements of Thrive. And it's really all about helping them to improve the performance of their people. And we work with the managers, we work with the people, we do development with them, but we all do it in these experimenting groups and with intact teams as a way of helping, to get specific and granular and help people to think about it within the context of their work. And then we have a group of advisors, and then we have these, what we call Thrive partners, who are also extended people who we've also trained up to help managers on a larger scale, because we now have about 2,000 people who are experimenting, and which is much greater than the 5 or 6 people who are working on this. So it's all about scale, and how do you tap into the energy of the population to help each other. And by the way, along those lines of tapping into energy, I want to just add something else that I've been thinking a lot about, is that there are always people in the organization who love working on people topics. And I can remember times, maybe a decade ago or more, where we were telling people, you can't do that. That's the last message I give people. I'm so happy to be able to tap into that energy now, right? And to figure out, how to let them run with it, how to give them the tools and the capabilities so that they can bring this further into their organization. For me, that's where it's at. It's not in formal classroom training anymore. I don't really like to do that.
Amen.
Amen. Amen indeed.
Our next question was going to be to ask you for advice, and I think you've given us some really good advice. The first one is think scale always, and then tap into pockets of energy that already exist, leverage the people on the ground. Are there other bits of advice that you would give talent leaders regarding sort of aligning to purpose?
I think you have to work at it every day. You can't get complacent. So as I was thinking about this idea and our discussion today, it reminded me of a book by a man named Stephen Mandis. And Stephen Mandis was at Goldman Sachs and wrote a book about his experience. And he then used the term organizational drift. And that really stuck with me, this organizational drift concept of how you can move away from your purpose and your core values without knowing it. And I guess any advice that I would give is that you really have to work at this every day. You just can't get complacent, or you risk organizational drift.
We always ask a question on the podcast, and we always have, even before we got the purpose bug. Why do you choose to do the work that you do, Rachel?
I think it's a mixture of happenstance and intention. Here's a story about when I first started my doctoral studies in 2013. The first class that I took was a class on writing your life history. And the idea behind writing your life history, doing this narrative, is that after you've written it, you analyze it and you understand the points along the line of your life that where there was something, an event or something meaningful or some kind of a change that helped you to learn and grow. And as an adult, aspiring adult educator at the time, or I guess I was already an adult educator, but an aspiring scholar, practitioner, educator. The idea is to understand what motivates people to learn and what are the points along which, you grow and develop. And so you start with yourself. I started with this when I grew up. I was a musician. I had never any intention to become a learning and development professional or somebody in the leadership and talent space. I started playing the cello when I was 6, and I thought I was going to be a cellist for the rest of my life. And I went to school. I got a master's degree in music, and then I went to Europe to play, and I became a professional cellist. And so I was writing about this, and then there was a shift, and I won't go into that because that's way too long and it requires, an evening together, post-COVID evening together. But what happened was that I started, talking about the shift that I made into the learning and development space. And I did that sort of via music. And as I was going through and looking at this timeline and looking at my narrative, reading through it again and again, I realized that actually I was coming back to something that was always very important to me, and that this was a very natural thing for me to do, even though at the time it felt so foreign, because both of my parents have advanced degrees. And education was such a deep core value in my family. And I think my children also suffered from it being such a core value. It's too bad I didn't do my doctorate before they were teenagers, because I ultimately learned how that value drove, many of the things that I expected of them, which, maybe wasn't as fair as it should, as I wanted it to be later on. But ultimately, being an educator and coming back into the learning and development space was very much aligned to who I am as a person.
Lovely story. How does your musical background play into? That's a really bad phrase. How does
pun, right?
Yeah, I'm going to change that. How does your musical background influence how you do your work, or does it at all? Are there any connections there?
It absolutely does. Everything I do is like a musical composition. When I design a program, it's almost like I can hear it in my head. I can hear how it starts, I hear how it evolves, and I hear how it ends. And so, when I think about a learning experience over, let's say, 18 months with a group of executives, it's like, I was never a composer, but I was always an interpreter of others' compositions. But it's the idea of how do you interpret, you could even go back to purpose, right? How do you interpret the goals of the company and translate that into an experience, for our people. And for me, there's something musical about that. How I write, whenever I have to write something, I hear the intonation, I speak it. I don't just write it. I have to read it. I have to hear the intonation. I have to hear the rhythm and feel the rhythm of it. So it's very much, and I also would say, just one final thought on that, is that I've never been somebody who's good at conforming. And I think, yeah, I know you're laughing because you both know that, right, about me. And I think that, that comes also from the spirit of being a musician, and you just have to have courage to be able to get up there and play in front of, 500 or 1,000 people. And you have to have something to say. You can't do it if you don't, right? And then there's also the perfectionism in me, because, being an artist doesn't, help with respect to perfectionism, because you actually want to be able to play every note you're supposed to, right? And especially when you get up in front of so many people. So that's another thing. I guess that's sort of more on the negative side, the desire to have everything perfect.
I was going to call you on this. So there's a lot of deliberate practice and hard work goes into it as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your time today and your insights on leading talent in a purpose-aligned organization. And it sounds like it's an ongoing experiment for you. And please come back and share with us how things go at some point in the future.
Sure.
Yeah, it's so much fun to be able to speak with you both.
So in this conversation, we talked to Rachel Fichter at S&P Global. And Danny, I think you and I interviewed her. Stacia, you've subsequently listened to the conversation. So let me start with you, Danny. What were your takeaways from the conversation that we had with Rachel?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway from me was the extent to which they are using purpose to drive decision-making. And particularly because they're S&P 500. I didn't expect them to be particularly purpose-driven, to be perfectly honest. And so I was really interested about some of the experiences she was having where she was sitting in rooms and they were actually using purpose to make decisions about the people practices that they were implementing. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, Rachel is a very, very interesting person. I think personally operates with a real sense of purpose. I thought that was really, really interesting and helpful too. I don't want to share too much about her story about music and her personal motivation, but that was pretty incredible stuff and definitely worth listening for. I thought a couple of things for me were interesting. One was, and I don't know whether either of you have come across this before, but she saw the word talent as a loaded term.
Yeah.
Right? I'd never reflected on that before at all. To me, talent was a better word than human resources because it was a little bit more human. But, she sort of pointed out that historically it's been used in quite an elitist way. Have you guys come across that before?
Yeah, we actually have. Talent sort of dehumanizes the individual. So if you use the word talent, you're actually stressing the skills and knowledge that that person has rather than the person themselves. I don't know how long it's been loaded, but it's been loaded for a while.
Yeah, we used to have a discussion years ago about whether to use the term talent because